but there was a little bit of different system in the South Atlantic, the triangle trade. Pretty much how that worked was food from New England was sold in the Caribbean, molasses was taken back, turned into rum, which was sold for other commodities, including slaves. So, yeah, pretty much you look at triangle trade graphic, type that into Google, you'll pretty much get a good idea of what that's like. The Dutch, then the British, went to war to seize control of the slave trade. They had some conflicts over that about who was getting the most slaves around, because the Dutch, while they were a little bit more tolerant in their cities such as New Amsterdam, they valued slave labor just as much. Sugar Islands were kind of the main source of the profits. It's also where the most slaves were. British went to war and seized New Amsterdam in New York in order to help enforce their mercantilist policies. So continuing trade over time with Europeans increased the flow of goods in and out of American Indian communities, stimulating cultural and economic changes and spreading epidemic diseases that caused radical demographic shifts. So there were some conflicts between Europeans and Native Americans in this time period. The value of European trade goods meant that Native Americans went to war to control the trade with the European colonies. They wanted in on some of that action. The fur trade caused massive environmental damages. Beavers were slaughtered, which ruined the lake and wetland environments they helped maintain. So that was something they didn't like. They didn't kill beavers really in the same way the French did, because the French and the Indians in that area was kind of the northern, just north of New England, really kind of the, it was kind of where the Great Lakes are now, Canada, and kind of stretching down all the way to Louisiana, that kind of band. If you look that up, just type in New France, and you can get an idea of what I'm talking about there into Google Images or something. So, yeah, the Beaver Wars broke out over this fur trade, and the French trying to work with the Indians didn't really end up going so well. The Iroquois Confederation repeatedly went to war over neighbors to seize control of the fur trade and European trade, pushing their neighbors to move or capture replacements for their lost tribe members in warring wars. So that's what they're trying to do there. Kind of just jockey for control and power. Diseases spread by traders, French fur trappers, and Native really cut into some of the Native American populations. And Native Americans were really forced to remake themselves into new groups and forge new identities and ways of survival, trying to get the up on the new technology that was coming in and getting more horses, getting more guns, and that they used to really fight amongst themselves, which didn't help their case at all. Interactions between European rivals and Indian populations fostered both accommodation and conflict. So pretty much everyone was going with each other, moving back and forth and saying that, or really every Indian group was kind of picked sides in multiple conflicts. The Dutch on the Iroquois, who warred against allies of the French. The French went to war with the Iroquois, who allied themselves with the British over time, or played the French and British off each other. So pretty much what you need to know is there's a lot of double dealing. The Indians kind of trying in the best way they could to use the innate European conflicts over resources in the area to get the most out of it for them and their own survival and self-preservation. Bacon's Rebellion actually began with the slaughter of frontier Native Americans for the purpose of slaughtering for more land. That's what they tried to do. And that's when Berkeley objected. That's kind of when the rebellion started. John Smith was saved by Pocahontas and the Powhatan Indian tribes. She eventually married John Rolfe and kind of became Europeanized. That was a rare kind of example of the fragile peace taking hold, but the Powhatan and the Europeans in that area, which is down the Chesapeake, they fought a lot. King Philip's War, or Metacom, if you remember him, he tried to drive the English back to the sea, but all the other Native American groups sided with the English, so they were pretty much wiped out. And I do apologize, Nathaniel Bacon was not killed in any interesting way. He was killed by dysentery, which isn't really that fun. But this guy, King Philip, or Metacom, that was kind of his... Metacom was his Indian name. Philip was his Europeanized name. He was cut up and sent to... his head was on a spike, very gruesome way of being killed. So he tried to... and really succeeded in killing a quarter... or a third of the New England population. He hit them really, really hard. They struck back even harder and wiped out his tribe pretty much. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, the Wag Wars, all had Native American groups on both the French and British sides. So a lot of conflict, and Indians really picked both sides at the time. King James II took over Virginia as a royal colony, as the English pretty much tried to seep in and consolidate control over all of the colonies, whether they be religious, whether they be given or owned by some joint stock company. Sooner or later, the British government, British Crown, had control over all of the British holdings in the New World. So Lord Baltimore and the Catholic minority, often at odds with the Protestant majority over in Maryland, kind of got along. We're kind of conflicted a little bit, but they eventually got along with the passage and then eventual dismissal of the Toleration Act, designed to protect the Catholic minority. Throughout the history of Maryland, Protestant majorities have fought Catholic minorities for control of the colonies, so that Toleration Act didn't exactly work well. The New England kind of got unhappy with Oliver Cromwell for declaring who was the leader of England for a time. You don't really need to know that. So we will move on, and pretty much what there is, and I'm just going to go through this quickly, is kind of a list of all the many, many conflicts, some of which are more important than others in the entire, between both European parties. Both the parties were European. So there were all sorts of conflicts over religion, whether or not to kill Indians, such as the Bacon's Rebellion, whether French Huguenots could, I'm definitely not saying that right, could immigrate to France where they could rebel or whatever. So there was just a bunch of the Wag Wars. Let's go through that one. The Wag and the French and the Indians. This is William and George, the names of the kings. This is pretty much the order of which they happened. William and George and the French and Indian Wars. Those are kind of the multiple conflicts over land gains, resource conflicts, all that happened kind of in New England area, and eventually, of course, the French and Indian War broke out. That was kind of the last of the conflicts. The French were kicked out after the French and Indian War. So those are some of the conflicts that you need to know. And of course, we're talking about some conflicts specifically here the British had with the American Indians. A lot of conflicts to get through. Miles Standish had a preemptive strike. The only Indians at the second Thanksgiving were the ones whose heads were on poles outside Plymouth's walls. So first Thanksgiving went right, but second Thanksgiving, not so much. Miles Standish had tried to do a preemptive strike, did not work out well for him. The Peacott War in Connecticut was waged to seize control of the Connecticut River Valley, where disease had not wiped out inhabitants of the English before they arrived. And we already mentioned King Philip's or Metacom's War was set to organize Indian alliances and drive the English out before the Indians lost complete control. About 5% of the English died, but 20% of the Indians died in reprisal. Really hit them hard, as you know. And of course, Bacon's Rebellion involved the right to slaughter Native Americans. And of course, the Wag Wars and the French and Indian Wars. Well, the French and Indian Wars weren't really very good for France, but the Indians were losers in all of them. So, yeah, that is the important thing to remember. The Native Americans, they took many, many L's over the course of their interactions with the Europeans. But one they did that was successful was the Pueblo Revolt, also known as Pope's Rebellion. Pope with a little accent on the E there, is the only ever successful Native American war against the Spanish in what would become the United States. The Spanish would be driven out for 20 years. When they returned, Native Americans were allowed to maintain their own territory with some aspects of their religion and culture. With the forced assimilation and encomienda system, that was all gone. They did not have to do that anymore. So congratulations to those people down there fighting off the Native Americans, fighting off the Europeans and getting to keep their own culture. So it's good to know about at least one Native American victory. Let's talk a little bit more now about the British colonies. The British colonies, they participated in political, social, cultural, and economic exchanges with Great Britain that encouraged both stronger bonds with Britain and resistance to British control. How's that possible? Well, We'll get into it. The presence of European religious and ethnic groups contributed to a significant degree of pluralism and intellectual exchange, which were later enhanced by the First Great Awakening and the spread of European Enlightenment ideas. So pretty much what that means is that there was a lot going on in the England colonies, the English colonies. There was a lot of religion happening, especially in Puritan land up in New England. But the thing was, there was a lot of other ideas, secularism coming in, and even some Enlightenment thought. So, yeah, the Puritans, they became hostile, increasingly so, towards Quakers and Catholics in extreme ways, with brandings, execution, and banishments. Roger Williams was banished by the Puritans. That led to the creation of Rhode Island as a place of tolerance. Anne Hutchinson, again, had a hearsay trial, and it was kind of a rejection of the patriarchy. First feminist, I guess you could say. Well, she kind of pretty much believed that God was speaking to her. She did not have to follow the Bible or any other authority. That's what her beliefs were. She's like, I don't need to follow the Bible. I feel God one-on-one is pretty much what she was saying. Roger Williams pretty much said that the Puritans were pretty much too nosy and too judgmental, and people want to practice religion to be able to practice religion in any way they want it without judgment or anything else like that. Down south, though, things were a little bit different because the Dutch heritage in New York, formerly New Amsterdam, but was then New York, was quite tolerant and multi-ethnic because everyone was tolerated there. The British tried to roll some of that back, but they were not all the way successful, and it is really one of the reasons why New York is one of the most diverse places, I think, in the country, really. They have so many different groups, black, white, Latino, Asian, and so many different ethnic groups that have come over throughout all these years. And that legacy was really started by the Dutch, and the British, even though they kind of wanted to, couldn't quite get it all away. The Quakers down in Pennsylvania, and of course they also came up to New York with Greeley, but they were mostly down in Pennsylvania at this time anyway. Religious and ethnic tolerance came to them and to their due belief in pacifism and the inner light. Germans and Scots-Irish came to them in large numbers and maintained their cultural identities, often in opposition to dominant Quakers, particularly with the Scots-Irish anger over Quaker pacifism. So there were some conflicts about conflict, believe it or not, between them, but they largely lived pretty harmoniously. The Great Awakening was kind of what inspired by some German ideas. Jonathan Edwards combined Locke's theory of the senses, Locke is an Enlightenment thinker, with his own revival of the Puritan conversion experiments. Brit George Whitefield's took then Edwards' hellfire and brimstone style of preaching, which sparked the Great Awakening across the 13 colonies, which split to pretty much the old lights and the new lights. So again, this is definitely something I think that is worth knowing for the upcoming test. It was a religious revival. It was not like more secularism and more Enlightenment ideas. It was a religious revival. And that kind of came in response to more secular, more Enlightenment ideas. The decline of religion led to it coming back in the Great Awakening in a very, very big way, because people were like, a lot of the colonies were founded mostly by Christians, Anglicans, Protestant, Catholics in some way, so they did kind of have a connection to this stuff. But there were some preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. They came around town to town preaching the gospel, emphasizing salvation from sins and promoting enthusiasm for Christianity. They pretty much went on a big marketing campaign saying things like, if you don't go to if you don't follow Christianity, you're going to go to hell. You're going to burn if you don't come do this. They made a very compelling case for this. God is watching. God is there, and He will punish you. So he was John Edwards was one of the chief followers. His message was centered on the idea that humans were sinners. God was an angry judge, but individuals need to ask for forgiveness. He preached justification by faith alone. That was his idea. He gave an infamous and emotional sermon entitled Sinners in the Angry Hands of God. News of the message spread quickly throughout the colonies. People were pretty scared. He was known for his passion and energy. He generally preached in his home parish, but there's many other revival preachers that traveled throughout the colonies. So here's a little bit of this sermon that he gave to give you an idea of what it was like, scaring people, like scaring them straight and back into religion here. And this is from Lesson 203, at least for Miss Mosca. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a